Hello everyone! Welcome to my music tutorials for people who want to compose music, but also people who simply want to enjoy music and understand it better. A while ago I wrote a sketch for you of a Scherzo symphony movement. It follows an early Romantic style inspired by Schubert. The sketch has a standard organization. Once you have a sketch of the whole movement and you have the flow and proportions right, then you need to orchestrate it. And last time I finished orchestrating part A1. This time we'll start A2. I'm not doing anything extravagant. I'm really trying to show you a typical, historically accurate, early Romantic orchestration. To begin with, let's listen to the first 22 measures. I did something unusual here, just so I could illustrate a point about orchestration. The first segment, which is loud, is in the first violins, and the second segment, which is quiet, has both first and second violins in octaves. That seems counterintuitive. You might think this octave sound, with its bigger resonance, would suit the loud part better, and usually that's true. But I wanted to show you that a change in tone quality is more important than a change in loudness. The octaves here don't have to be loud. They have a distinct sound to them, and you can use that sound nicely in a loud part or a quiet part. And here I've shifted it down an octave to switch things up again and keep the tone quality always changing. Always keep the sound changing. Next, let's put in some background harmonies. These are simple block chords. Here in the quiet part, I thinned it out and put in only a few background notes. And in the end, with a crescendo, I beefed up the sonority again. Note the heavy block chords at the end of the crescendo, with double stops for a more powerful sound. The double stops allow for a very dense packing of notes in these upper registers, which, to my ear, gives a special, intense, punching kind of string sound. The passage now sounds like this. It's cute, but we need a lot more to make it lively and interesting. I typically work on the woodwinds after the strings. And first I'm going to put in the bassoons here, doubling the violas and the cellos. I didn't like how these notes in the lower strings faded out on us. The bassoon will give it a nice little kick to make it stand out. And now let's put in some very simple woodwind chords to highlight the rhythms. Since the bassoons are already used for something else, the chords will include only the clarinets, oboes, and flutes. The voicing here is standard. It's simple block harmony. For fun, I varied the top a little, just so it isn't boring and uniform. And at the end of the passage, when the music reaches a climax, we can put in some woodwind chords to add to the string chords. The upper winds now sound like this. That nice eighth note rhythm will beat time in the background, behind the melody, and add a layer of interest to the music. Let's do something fun and keep the rhythm consistent throughout all of these measures. It would be boring to fill in the off measures with more woodwind chords, so let's use a totally different sound. We'll alternate between the woodwinds and the brass. I could use a different instrument here just as well. But I want to show you a lovely, dark, special sound of subdued trumpets and drums. I know it's marked forte, but functionally, here the trumpets are playing a background, relatively subdued role. And let's have even more fun. To keep the sound always changing, here we can use the trombones and timpani. Quiet trombones have a beautiful dark sound. Notice I'm using 2 trombones. We have 3 available, but that would be too much power. We could use 1, but that's too naked. 2 together give a smoother, more rounded sound. And for the big chords at the end, let's add in a standard big brass sonority, trombones and trumpets together to add noise to these fortissimo chords. Let's listen to the upper winds, the brass, and the timpani together. It's kind of cool. What we need is some horn glue to hold it all together. I'm a great fan of the blanket of horns technique, especially for a romantic orchestra sound, and here we have a lot of contrasting instruments bopping in and out, so I feel like we need something sustaining in the background to blend it all together. When you use horns as sustaining notes, it's tempting to just put them in the background, holding long notes, blurring all the orchestral sonorities together, like holding down the sustain pedal on the piano. But that is not the best way to use them. It's better to think about their rhythmic contribution. The horns should have carefully considered entrances. They should add to the sense of layered richness, where each musical layer has its own integrity. Here I've put the horns on the offbeat, and given them accent marks to show that I mean those entrances to be heard. Horns in octaves beating out a background rhythm is very common, very effective. When we get to the quieter part, I've thinned it out a bit so the horn blanket isn't too heavy. And this is what the horns sound like throughout this passage. Note that, although it's a very simple tune, it has many orchestral layers. Layer 1 is the melody, Layer 2 is the string harmonies, Layer 3 is the woodwind bouncy chords, Layer 4 is the brass and timpani rhythm, and Layer 5 is the horns with their own background rhythm. Each one of these layers makes its own independent contribution to the sound. This kind of orchestral layering can give a lot of depth and interest and forward momentum. Here's what it sounds like all put together. It pauses for a breath, and now we're ready for the next passage. Let's focus on the next 16 measures. First, let's clean up the melody line. I've left it in the first violins, but we can always change it later if we feel like it. Here's how the melody sounds. A quick note on dynamic markings. In orchestral scores, usually you don't use a lot of mezzo forte or mezzo piano. You commit to a P or an F. If you want subtler shades, you do it with orchestration, adding or subtracting instruments. But occasionally I find the MF to be useful. It says to the performer, this part is to be louder than the surrounding parts. But don't go to town on it. Don't make it so loud that it's some kind of blaring moment. So yes, I find MF useful at times. I know some people religiously avoid it, and I 90% avoid it, but it does have its uses. Anyway, now let's start building up orchestral layers around this tune. Let's add a counter melody like this. It's not complicated. It's just enough to add a sense of something going on in the background, something quirky and interesting. Here's what it sounds like. Now let's add some background rhythms. Following almost exactly the same pattern as in the last passage, we'll put them in the woodwinds. But we'll change it up a little. Last time the woodwinds had 2 eighth notes bopping along in each measure. Here we'll put in 3. The rhythm is morphing, changing to keep things interesting. As for the distribution of notes, here I've used a very standard, simple approach and put the woodwinds in thirds. The clarinets are in thirds, the oboes are an octave higher, the flutes double the oboes. By combining these 3 different kinds of woodwinds, you blend out some of the individual, quirky, gritty character of each instrument. You create a kind of generalized, smooth woodwind sound. In more modern orchestration, that's not so desirable. You might want the color and character intrinsic to each instrument. But in early Romantic orchestration, the blended sound is more common, and I think it works. It makes sense here. And of course, you may have guessed it, I think we need those rhythmic figures to alternate between the high woodwinds and something in a lower register. In the last passage, I used timpani and trumpets, but I want a lighter sound here for a passage that should feel light on its feet. So let's use the cellos and a bassoon doubling them. You know what, let's even switch it up here by adding the horns. Now we have 4 orchestral layers. Layer 1 is the melody. Layer 2 is the counter melody. Layer 3 is the upper woodwind rhythmic figure. Layer 4 is the cello and bassoon rhythmic figure. And for a passage that should be light on its feet, we don't need any more instruments. This is sufficient. Let's listen to the complete orchestration of this passage. Let's do one more passage today, a short one. First, let's listen to the sketch. That's what we have to work with, a crescendo that ends in these chords. And rather than go through every detail, I'll just point out a few key choices. Here's my orchestration of it. I'll point out 5 details. First, notice I left out the choppy little rhythms in the background. Those rhythms have dominated the movement so far, but here I thought we'd back away from them for a moment, as though we're pausing, taking a breath, in preparation for the action to come roaring back in again. It's a way of building expectation, of tension. The rhythms begin to come back in here in the horns, and then they rise up until it hits us full blast in the entire orchestra. So removing the background rhythms at the start of the passage and having them surge back at the end is a way of shaping this crescendo. The second thing I want to point out is the simplicity of the horn part. It's all one note. In modern orchestration, horns often have much more complex parts. They have a lot of agility, they're good at melodies, and they can make a lot of colorful sound effects. But in the early Romantic period, they still tend to be used very conservatively. They hit mostly the main background notes to support other instruments. Or they add background rhythms like they do here, or they blend the sound together with sustaining notes. When they do carry melodies, the tunes are usually simple. I feel like horn writing actually regressed in the early Romantic period. You get a lot more interesting horn writing in Mozart than you do in Schubert. And yet, the more conservative horn writing has a special beauty to it. It works. It's as if when the horns can do anything, they have less value. But when they can do only certain things, they have more of a stately power and value while doing it. The third thing I want to point out is that I used a method I've shown you many times in past videos, but that I haven't used very much yet in this movement. The woodwinds double the string melody to color the sound. The oboe doubles the first violins and gives a little extra urgency and intensity. The bassoons double the melody here. Then we're back to the oboes, and here the flutes double the violins. By doing this, I bring a shifting tone color to the melody, so that even though it's carried continuously by the first violins, it feels like it's constantly changing, constantly in motion. A fourth detail to point out is the flute sustaining note. Yes, even the flutes can play the role of a sustaining note. I find that a high flute sustaining note always gives a sense of urgency to the music, like in the storm movement of Beethoven 6. I didn't want it to stand out too much, so I marked it for one flute instead of two. And finally, I want to point out what happens at the end of the crescendo. An orchestral crescendo doesn't sound good if it merely gradually increases until it happens to reach its peak. No, it needs a sudden explosion at the end. A crescendo should be more like a tire that gets inflated. It gets bigger and bigger. The pressure builds until, bang, it suddenly explodes. That's what gives it a satisfying conclusion. Notice that every instrument in the orchestra participates in the bang at the end. Let's listen to how this passage turned out. And now let's backtrack to the beginning of today's lessons. Here we are again at the start of the A2 section. Let's hear all of that music together so you can get a sense of how the different parts flow into each other, and especially how they contrast with each other, creating an ever-changing sound. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed learning about music here, and make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. I'll talk to you next time.